Hello, everyone. This is Ed Breniger, and this is the Eddie Network podcast. And my guest today is Alex Nagy. And I've met Alex through his parents, and I'm going to let Alex tell you about who he is and what he does. Welcome, Alex. Glad you're here.
Hi, thank you. So my name's Alex Nagy. I'm from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Currently what I'm doing is I'm currently studying my master's in piano performance at Florida State University under the tutelage of David Kalhouse. I grew up doing all sorts of things. Music was always something I did. We've always had a piano in the house. My mom taught me a little bit of piano before I formally started taking piano lessons. I always enjoyed playing piano, but I really kind of off with it in high school because ironically the story with that goes that I really wanted to make the soccer team because I really liked playing soccer, but I didn't make the soccer team and I really wanted something to do after school. So I joined the marching band, ironically, and I picked up percussion, learned to play the xylophone in the pit, and playing music with other people for the first time really made me realize how much I enjoyed playing music. And so all of a sudden my piano, which I kind of plateaued with just because I was low motivation in middle school, just all of a sudden took off and I shot up and started practicing a lot more and got into college. Went to Furman University for my undergraduate, studied with Derek Parsons there, and I had a great time. Now I'm in my master's degree.
So does it require extraordinary talent to be able to go and major in an instrument like that? Or is it something that a person who has average talent can work really hard and achieve?
I mean, the word talent is always something that musicians kind of shy away from because yes, there is talent involved in pursuing music. Like you need to have the brain and the skills to play an instrument or sing well or conduct or whatever you're doing. But behind the scenes is actually a lot of really hard work. And what a lot of people think of as talent from a young person doing well in music is just years and years and years of hard work that no one else sees because they're doing that at home at night. So a lot of people will start playing an instrument when they're very young. And people that have innate talent will take to playing that instrument and enjoy and learn really well while they're young. But by the time they're in like high school and they're playing at very advanced repertoire, at that point, it's not necessarily talent. It's a lot of just hard work that they've put in that was enabled by talent early on.
I have recently found a Polish pianist named Marta Czech, and she's got a lot of solo recordings on YouTube. I've been watching them, and I'm impressed. She's really young. I think she's around your age, and I'm impressed with her facility at being able to play these. I mean, she played all of. I mean, I think she's done all of Beethoven's sonatas. I mean, it's a massive repertoire that she's achieved. So I'm watching her play, and so it also raises the question of technique. And I understand that there is different opinions about how your hands are to approach the keys. Could you say something about that?
Yeah, so that's something that's kind of like the whole goal of any musician is to achieve such high technique that they are not held back by any technical limitations and they can be purely expressive at their instrument. Ironically, though, with an instrument like piano, there's lots of different schools of playing. I don't fully understand the differences between every different school of playing, but I can tell you that there's like a German school of playing, a Russian school of playing, somewhat an American school of playing, and those all stem back to certain prodigious composers and pianists that had their own fame and started their own schools, and their students go on to teach a lot. And while I am still in my schooling and I don't fully understand exactly what all the different technical aspects are of these schools of playing, I could probably listen to someone and tell you where they're coming from.
That's really fascinating because she, in what she was playing, one of the things she was playing was the Art of the Fugue pieces, you know, and most people who know that piece from listening to piano players know it from Glenn Gould. And he gets a lot of criticism for the way he approaches it. You know, I forget, I've saw one video where I forget who it was. It was an older pianist, classical pianist, concert pianist. And he says, I don't hear Bach, I hear Gould when I hear him play that. You know, so is there really a kind of a stylistic thing that becomes identified with the person itself in doing this?
Yes, it's partially stylistic in like their artistry and their interpretation, and partially it's in their approach to the keyboard. I know in the case of Glenn Gould, I know I was listening to an interview from one of his classmates from like I think the 70s, where she was describing how one of the like technical exercises that their professors used was to have them place their hands on the keys, and you would play a staccato touch on the tips of your finger with the other hand, kind of playing the key through one finger to the other. And what that would do is to teach the hand that's not actively playing a light, short touch. And that he apparently like took over and did that for like everything he did with Bach, which is why when you listen to him, every note is very sharp and crisp and even, which in a sense imitates the sound of a harpsichord.
Right.
But he also does some things on his own interpretively with the piano that is not stylistic to harpsichord playing of Bach. So that's where some people criticize him of not playing it authentically. It's because he's doing things that you can't do on a harpsichord because he's playing on a piano. But some of the approaches he's doing bring out the sharp sound of the instrument that the music was originally written for. And that's where artistry comes in, is that if you're playing something like Bach that was not explicitly written for the piano, but you're playing it on the piano, you as the pianist have to decide, do I want to try and play this historically and perfectly accurately? And if that's the case, should I even be playing it on the piano? Or are you going to go completely on the opposite end and say, well, Bach wasn't writing this for piano, but I'm playing it on the piano, so who cares what he would have wanted? That's a very wide spectrum of what people decide to do in music, and you have a lot of freedom both in the techniques you're approaching. Are you using more of a harpsichord sound? Are you playing very romantically with a legato touch? And also interpretively, are you going to approach it more from a terrace dynamics perspective that you would do with a harpsichord? Or are you going to do more gradual dynamics with lots of pedal that you could play if you're doing romantic piano repertoire?
I mean, this has got my head spinning because I've been listening to this kind of music forever, you know, all my life, and I really love it. Um, do you have? Let's broaden this out a little bit. Do you have a particular um, time of music that you really like? Time's not the right word, but era of music that you really gravitate towards?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of bounce around. It sounds cliche to say, but as everyone does, everyone loves the Romantics, the Romantic era, the 19th century. Chopin's great, Brahms is great. I love Liszt, Rachmaninoff, all those, the concertos that always get played with orchestras. Everyone loves those. So you kind of have to acknowledge that, like, I'm probably always going to program a romantic piece on any recital I do. But in my studies, I've really found that I like looking into some more modern music in more recent times. I played the Hinastera on my recital that you referenced earlier. But the professor I'm studying with now is like super into modern music. He's pushed me to play with the New Music Ensemble at Florida State a few times. And while in my solo repertoire, I haven't done anything like crazy and modern, I think that's something that we're going to be looking towards doing this next year.
So when we're talking about modern, who are we talking about? What composers are you going to be looking at to play?
So the modern era, I mean, kind of starts around the start of the 20th century. Um, right now, I'm working towards learning the Piano Sonata by Bartok, which was written in 1926, which is kind of crazy to think about how that's almost 100 years ago.
Yeah.
But um, it's one of the more important pieces of the 20th century because he came out with like a very new style of approaching piano technique and piano writing that had a lot of influence on composers that weren't writing in a serialist method akin to the 12-tone school. So I'm playing that right now, kind of prepare me to learn some more modern things that are inspired by that percussive style that Bartok really pioneered. Um, but additionally, at with the new music ensemble, I've worked with a number of student composers to premiere some pieces this year. So that's also been a blast. Is just working with living composers and getting their opinions on music because so rarely do you get to ask the composer their thoughts on why did you slur this way or why do you have this dynamic scheme. That's something that you so rarely get to do because all these composers are dead.
There's a video also of Yuja Wang, and she was talking with the composer, and I should have looked this up before we went on air, but he wrote this concerto for her. And there's a European guy who's done that, but this is an American, and it's very American, and it was a very interesting piece. Um, I felt like it was a little muddled, but that's just my own sensibility. But I guess what I want to know is when you start to work on particularly one of these modern pieces, which is very kind of an awkward set of rhythms and melodies, and if there is one, and how long does it take to actually learn it? You know, at kind of a basic level. Oh, I know what I'm supposed to do. Now I have to figure out how to perfect it. Well, how long does that take?
I mean that varies from piece to piece and from composer to composer, because sometimes things just line up and they lock together in your brain and you can get it out really quickly, and sometimes you just really have to actually doing because once you've gotten past the technical challenge of actually getting the notes in your fingers, sometimes pieces are more straightforward than others. An excellent example of that, I recently this semester had to do a lecture recital as part of my degree requirements. And so I played some pieces by Alexander Scriabin, um, who is kind of a turn of the century Russian composer. Um, started out trying to imitate a lot of Chopin, but with very late 19th century Russian idioms. And turn of the century, he kind of goes off the deep end and tries to invent this like new almost atonal style that a lot of people shy away from because it just doesn't really make sense. The rhythms are weird, the melodies are sometimes non-existent. Um, but I found that I really loved the music, and once I got past the notes, those pieces to me actually really locked together because I was able to do a harmonic analysis. I read a couple of theory papers on what he's actually doing with these sets of tone clusters, and I was able to figure out pretty quickly under because I was under a time crunch actually. I was able to figure out pretty quickly like the form and the structure of what he was doing, because he laid it out very romantically with like ternary form or kind of just like variations on binary form. And the formal analysis really helped me learn it in a very short amount of time. But sometimes you play a more modern piece that is more freeform or just doesn't have a specific standard form associated with it, or maybe the harmony is just really unique. and you're trying to think to like what point, what moment is the climax that I'm trying to get to, and how do I build that? And it really just depends piece to piece how quickly you can figure that out. And if the composer's alive, maybe they'll be willing to help you figure that out. Sometimes they won't, though.
That's fascinating. So are you doing some composing yourself?
No, I've attempted multiple times to figure out the composing, but I've not been able to get a melody down on paper that I actually like.
Let's explore that a little bit. So, because I wonder about musicians. I wonder if they wake up in the middle of the night and there's this tune in their head, and they got to get up and go write it down. And they get up, they go to their piano, or they go to guitar, and is does it begin that way? That there's some kind of emergent reality that comes to them. Oh, I'm hearing this. Oh, that's really good. I need to write that down.
I mean, sometimes yes. While I was in undergrad, I sometimes was taking jazz lessons, and my professor would tell me that like sometimes he'd wake up in the middle of the night and had an idea for a lick, but he obviously didn't want to wake everyone up in his house, so he'd just like sing it into his voice memo and then go back to bed, and then he'd tune it out on the piano the next day. Um, so that's one example of that. Definitely does happen. Um, a couple of my friends here are composers, and sometimes they do that where they just hear something and they write it down. But a lot of composers actually like start with a framework of like, here's what I'm trying to do with this piece, and they'll just sit down and grind for like 2 hours and just churn out notes as the ideas come to them, kind of like free writing, and then they'll just chop it down later and edit it down into something a little more palatable.
So what is a guy who knows how to play the piano well and now is in his master's program in music school? What do you look at as your future? What's your future here?
So my goal is really I want to teach. I've always been kind of involved in teaching people. Starting in high school, I was a few years ahead in math, and so I was a math tutor, and I really liked working with people and helping people that either didn't understand or wanted to understand better. And then once I got into college, I had some opportunities to teach music because I taught piano, and I was able to get a position as kind of a teaching assistant for the theory class. And then for the next year, I was able to do that for one of the freshman music history classes as well as for the freshman keyboard class. So I've really found that I really enjoy teaching. Um, so that's one of my goals, is that I really like being able to take my experience and use that to help other people better themselves. Obviously, I'm studying performance because I enjoy performing and I enjoy getting better at the piano. And in order to teach, that's kind of what you need to do, is you need to master your instrument so that you're someone worth studying with.
So you're looking at teaching as an academic thing rather than as a private lessons that you're doing.
I'm probably going to end up doing like a mix of all of that.
Okay.
I like working with private. I also think I would probably like working with college students. That's currently part of what I'm doing right now as my assistantship. Is I have secondary piano students, which are people who are not piano majors but are taking lessons as college students for credit, and so I teach that. This has actually been my first time teaching like advanced level repertoire. It's been a lot of fun.
Wow. So what what would you recommend to someone who is older who has a desire to learn to play the piano? What would your recommendation be?
Go take lessons. Um, I mean, it's never too late to start learning an instrument. I mean, there is scientifically the whole phenomenon of very, very young people picking skills up very quickly, kind of like Lane, you just learn things really quickly. But once you get past that, like, why not learn an instrument? I mean, you don't have to practice 4 hours a day to become the world's next leading virtuoso. And if someone is older and already has a career and they just want something to do for fun, like practicing should be fun. Part of practicing is working on exercises to get better, but proper teaching will incorporate those in a way that makes getting better at the piano enjoyable. So if you're an older individual and want to learn the instrument, go take piano lessons. And teachers love working with older people because you don't have to deal with the fact that someone is younger than you and thinks differently than you.
Yeah.
Because if you're an adult and you know how adults think roughly, you can give an adult instructions and they can figure it out. But when you're teaching young kids, you have to think about like what age they are and how they think, and then tailor the way you give them instructions so that way they'll understand what you're telling them to do.
And I guess it would also teach you a lot of patience.
It does teach you a lot of patience, yes.
Which
I've taught some young kids before, and you have to be patient with them. And me being someone who's struggled with focus when I was a little kid, you have to give them a little grace when they can't pay attention.
Yeah. Well, I own a piano. I don't currently have it with me where I live, but I've thought about recovering it and beginning to take lessons. So that's on my bucket list. And I'd like to learn, not so much that I can go play songs, but I'd like to learn so I can understand better how these pianists that I respect so highly play. And in particular, I like jazz pianists too. People like Art Tatum and Thelonious Monk, and how they are able to do what they do, with the music that they create. It's fascinating to me. And does that stuff fascinate a student as well? I mean, is that something that, I guess what I'm asking is, are you so overwhelmed with the content of the lessons and the courses that you have that you really don't have time to think about these kind of ancillary things out there off on the horizon?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
Well, I mean, do you go kind of searching for music, piano music in particular, that is not within the realm of what you are normally focused on, like learning how to play stride piano? Like, okay, can you play stride piano? That sort of thing. Learning things that other pianists are doing that they probably are not teaching you in a classical program.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of pianists will do that. I personally have not gone and learned a bunch of jazz. I tried taking some jazz lessons, and it just wasn't really something that stuck with me. I'm a very like prepared person. I like to go in confidently knowing what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do it, which is a very classical way of thinking. And when you're going to play something like jazz piano, that's just a very different way of thinking, because you've prepared. I don't want to speak incorrectly on jazz because I'm not the most experienced jazz person, but you've prepared things in your improvisational vocabulary that you can pull out when you're improvising over a tune, and
yeah,
you work out your ear so much to be in connection with your instrument that you can just hear something and play it. So if you're improvising and you hear something in your head, that you'll say, "Oh, this sounds good over this progression," and you just play it, which is very much a in the moment, we'll just figure it out kind of mindset that I personally have struggled with. But every pianist that I know who's learned that skill is better off for it.
Well, I would say that it's a skill that transcends music and actually is a great thing to have for life in general.
Yeah. One of my friends actually minored in jazz in his undergraduate, and he is just he's phenomenal, because like he takes so much less time to get pieces under his fingers for that first stage of learning that we were talking about earlier, because he's he's probably played that combination of notes at some point before, and he's so confident that his fingers will just do what he tells them to.
That's fascinating. Huh. So,
But the only skill for pianists to learn.
so what kind of music, other than the stuff that you're learning, that you like, and what, give us a little sense of what I'm assuming you're in your early 20s. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm currently 23 years old.
So what is it that you listen to on a regular basis that um, would that you think that people who are not your age, who maybe are older, um, should explore and maybe listen to? Anything that out there?
I mean, I listen to a lot of music. Some of it is classical, some of it is not. I listen to a lot of kind of like early 2000s rock. I recently realized that while I didn't really grow up like intently listening to like pop and rock music, that was the music my sister played in the car as she drove me to school. And like one of my friends was really into the band Green Day, and like all their songs I kept recognizing when they came on in the car. And I was like, wait, I know all this music. And so I kind of went back and rediscovered all this music that I actually knew. I just didn't really recognize that I knew it. So that's one thing I listen to, is a lot of that. But a thing that I really like listening to is actually video game soundtracks, because I grew up playing video games, and some of the video games I grew up playing are games that have been recognized as having the best soundtracks in video games. And it's also really, really cool, having studied music academically, to hear these video game soundtracks and know what their influences actually are. And I just think that's really neat.
That reminds me of music that I've heard that was done by Japanese anime filmmakers. It's very similar, and the music is very different. It's not like any other filmmaking music, but it's really interesting. I'm thinking the one movie that comes to mind is Paprika. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
I've not seen that.
I bet you I know less than two people who have seen it. So, but it's a very interesting story, very unconventional, but the music in it is very emotive of the action that's taking place, and it has a kind of a mechanical feel to it, but yeah, it's a very interesting stuff. So the video game music, is there a way to access this other than with video games? Do they put these out in on playlists and things like that?
That really depends on the video game and the video game company. Lots of companies will release their soundtracks onto Spotify and Apple Music and whatever. You can probably find most video game tracks on YouTube. That's actually a big conversation in the video game music scene, is Nintendo, who is very protective of their intellectual property, like never releases their soundtracks. And it's kind of interesting why it's a bunch of copyright law that I don't fully understand why they don't. But from what I understand in reading into copyright law, someone like Nintendo doesn't sell their music because that apparently leads it to be able to be like remixed and whatever under legal terms. And I don't fully understand it, but some companies are very restrictive and don't release their soundtrack, but other companies will just sell CDs of their soundtracks and they'll be on streaming platforms.
Yeah,
but yeah, I mean, the fail safe is always to go to YouTube. Someone's probably uploaded a maybe not legal recording of it somewhere.
Yeah, there's a lot of that on there. Yeah, I found that to be true. Well, let me. Are you in your program? Are you all talking about the role of AI, artificial intelligence, in the future of music and in the kind of the things that you all are doing in a music school? Is that a topic of?
I haven't really interacted with AI much in my classes. I would I would be willing to bet that if not right now, probably in the next few years, electronic music courses will be talking about AI. But personally, I'm not scared about AI taking over music and music performance because part of what people listen to music for is the human element of performance. That's partially why going out to a bar and hearing live music is so great. It's because even if this isn't like the world's most renowned band, it's like an amazing concert. Like this is people playing music, and you can't really replace that with a robot. Even if you can get a robot to do it quote correctly and quote perfectly, um,
So what's
that kind of takes the human element out of the performance, which is really what people are
that
looking
human element? What is that human element that you see? Let's let's dig down a little bit on that, because I think it's really important. I totally agree with you, and it's a topic that I'm talking with people all the time. You know that. So what is human about music? Let's put it in those terms.
Well, I mean, if you look at the way musicians perform on their instrument, there's a lot of nuance. With specifically piano, there's a lot of nuance to the way you approach the keys because the way you hit the key will change the quality of the sound, even at the same dynamic level. You can change the way the note sounds coming out of the soundboard at one volume level by hitting the key differently.
Well, you can hear that if you listen to, say, one of Rachmaninoff's concertos, and you can hear that the difference between the soloists, the pianists in every one of those, and how different they approach it, and how different the conductor's approaching it in terms of pacing and and all of that. So that's one aspect of it. The that it becomes personal for the performer, I guess, is the way of saying that.
Yeah, but another reason why I don't think that AI is going to take over classical music is that if you're looking at that level of nuance, computers are programmed as ones and zeros, on or off, and increasing levels of nuance are just increasing complexities of computer processes, but it all boils down to on and off. And if you've ever listened to a player piano, it's on and off. Um, Recently, Steinway has come out with a line of pianos called the Stereo, which basically allows them to sample or record a pianist's playing, not as a sound file, but as a series of inputs. And it can record, I don't remember the frequency of how many times per second it records the position of the key, but it records very accurately someone's recording. And so what you can do is if you have one of these stereos in your house, is you can pull up Yuja Wang's recording of some Schumann piece that she recorded through that, and then hear Yuja Wang playing on that instrument. And that is still a human performance because it's a human doing the inputs and then a computer recreating those human inputs. But it still won't sound the same as if a human is playing it, because to me, I think it boils down to like there's risk and reward in playing an instrument. So if someone's recorded something and that's their recording and they got a perfect take, as an audience member, there's no more risk reward to listening to that recording because it's going to be how it was recorded.
Right.
And so it's the same thing with a computer, is that if you've hypothetically programmed a computer to be artistic and original and whatever in performance, even if artistically it is like the most stunning performance ever, to me, I wouldn't get as much out of listening to it because there's not the satisfaction in knowing that humans, which are very imperfect beings, pulled something like that off.
Yeah.
So that's my take on AI and computers in music.
Oh, I would agree with you, and it's going to be well. The thing is it's always, at least at this point, it's derivative of what's been done before. And I mean, if you could sit down and play, you know, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata and play it in a way that is very personal to you, and somebody hears that as if they've never heard that piece of music before, that's not what they're going to get from AI. I would suspect they're going to get that from Alex Nagy and his playing of that, and your performance of that live is going to be really where that is captured more specifically, because the next time you play it, it'll be different than the time that you played it before. I mean, am I right about performance like that?
Yeah, I mean, I always like listening to live recordings better than like studio recordings, because they even though they are a recording and you're still listening to a recording instead of live performance, they somewhat capture that element of risk and reward in pulling off a performance. Like, every performer has their own difficulties that they're overcoming. Like, part of how performers shape their sound is their background and what their strengths and weaknesses are, and they play into those. So even if you're listening to a live recording that where they didn't have the chance to edit and fix notes and whatever, you're still hearing them approaching a performance from their strengths and weaknesses and shaping the music according to their own abilities. A really fantastic example of that is one of the most famous recordings of a concerto is Horowitz's last recording of Rachmaninoff's Third with the New York Philharmonic in the 70s, I think it was. And there's just wrong notes all over the place, but you don't really care about it because it's a live recording. You feel the intensity of it being a live recording. You hear people coughing in the recording. And you hear someone who's at the very end of their career still overcoming the difficulties of old age. And it's really fascinating to listen to. But when you listen to like a studio recording of Rachmaninoff's concerto, it feels, even if it's technically and musically more accurate, it feels a little more dead because you don't have that audience connection that is captured in the recording.
I subscribe to the Berlin Philharmonic channel, and I'm watching almost every day something there, and I'm constantly moved by what I see. And what I see, and then I think this is the human element, is not just the performance of the individuals, but the performance of them as a collective, as a group, and how challenging that must be to be able to as the orchestra conductor, to pull that group of people together and play together so that something that they're playing that everybody has already heard before is being heard almost as if it's a brand new piece of music.
Yeah, I mean, that's the fascinating thing about ensembles and ensemble performances, is that every performance is going to be different, because even if you're taking the exact same group of people and playing the same piece again, everyone in that group will have matured since the last time they played the piece, and people will come forward with new ideas. And that's what's so great about ensemble performances, is that even pieces that are 400 years old could mean something completely new to a new group of people because they've come up with new ideas since the last time they played it.
Do you think that music is an expression of our humanity in a way that other forms of art are not is not?
Um,
Have you ever thought of that? I mean, that's a conversation I've had with people who are musicians. They see that there's something inherently human about that expression that's different than what the painter does or a sculpture does. That
I'm not sure what my opinion is on that. I've done a lot of reading and research about like the influence of philosophy on music, and it's interesting that if you look at specifically, actually not even a specific time period, if you look at particularly in European history with music, music has always been something that has been either revered or feared by philosophers and religious thinkers throughout the years. In fact, every musician who takes music history in college and has to learn about the medieval era and the origins of chant and whatever learns about these religious scholars that feared having complex music in their services because they felt like it would affect the audience's soul too much, and that they wanted to keep it too dumbed down enough so that it wouldn't, so that the compositions of an earthly composer wouldn't lead someone's soul astray. And that's an idea that goes all the way back into like the medieval era. And that that thought of the ability of music to affect a person stretches all the way even into the 19th century and probably into the 20th century. I haven't read too much 20th century philosophy, so I can't really speak on that. But a lot of the Enlightenment and the 19th century philosophers always placed music as the highest art form in terms of its ability to affect one's very core.
so when you're playing the piano, you're not simply playing the piano in a mechanistic way. Your whole body is engaged with that. There's a level of feeling with that. There's a level of maybe communication is a part of that or something. But it to me it feels like that the performance of music is different than other art forms because you're having to present something fresh when you perform, and it's something when you got people together doing it. Let me give you an example. When I was in college, which go it was soon after they invented electricity. No, not quite. I had the opportunity to hear the Modern Jazz Quartet. I don't know if you're familiar with them, and they're a quartet that's formed like a classical quartet, except for the vibes, the vibra but the piano, the drum set, and a bass. And you know, here I am, a young guy about your age, and I'm watching them play, and what I saw happening was them talking to each other nonverbally through their instruments, and they were looking at each other, and they knew what was going on. I mean, the expression was relational. Let me put it that way. And and that for that reason, I had this sense that music has a different character to it because of this inherent ability of two or more musicians to actually talk to each other when they're playing.
Yeah, I mean, even though I haven't really played much jazz, you feel that even when you're playing classical music in a chamber music setting. Like I've accompanied singers, I've accompanied instrumentalists, I've played chamber music, and in all those settings, there's a nonverbal communication that's more than just like nodding to give someone a pickup. It's like you will put more into your part when someone else has a big moment, because you want that moment to be made for them, and then they'll put that energy back into their part when you have a big moment, because they want your part to be effective. And it's really an interesting thing when you play music with people, is much less prepared, because something can go wrong and derail a performance, and you need to be like on your toes thinking about like how can I help my partner succeed in this performance.
So are you saying that there is, say, more latitude in how you play the notes when, particularly when you're playing it with others, so that what you're creating is almost an interpretation of the work that's on the paper, on the score?
Yes, that's the core of being a classical musician, is that you're not just recreating what's on the page, is you're adding to it and creating your own version of it. It's like, imagine if a composer gave you a bunch of different discs for a kaleidoscope, and you have those discs for the kaleidoscope,
Yeah.
but it's up to you to decide what order you're going to put the kaleidoscope pieces in. And it'll still look similar because it's all the same discs, but it'll be just the littlest bit different that it makes all the world and can take on a completely different appearance to an audience member.
That's great. That's really great. I love that very much, because I think what we're getting at is something that's really important for the future of our world. And in a lot of schools, they've been de-emphasizing music and arts, and that's unfortunate, because I think those things are very important for people, and they've been important for me. I wouldn't say I'm an artist. I'm a writer. That's where my art is. But I think that these things are very important for people's development. And if you learn to play music, then you can learn to communicate with people. You can have conversations with people. And if you look at the YouTube has all these channels where people are talking about music, and they're talking, all of a sudden they start playing together. It's really I love.
Yeah.
I mean, it's such a interesting thing.
Yeah, it's really fun playing with people, and it's honestly probably my favorite thing to do, is every chance I've gotten to play with people. Because like you can sit in a practice room and learn music that's for your own solo instrument all day, and you might be the world's greatest recitalist, but there's just something so enjoyable and human and intimate and vulnerable about playing with someone on a stage. Because you know you want to feature your partner just as much as your partner wants to feature you, and that's a really special connection.
There's a group, I think, in Amsterdam, which has been elevating the performance of Baroque music. Bach. It's a Bach. I forget the name of the group, but
Is it the Netherlands Bach Society?
yes, that's what the Netherlands Bach Society. And I really like what they're doing, because I don't. Maybe you can explain it to me, but they make it feel very electric and very alive, and where other people, maybe it feels very calm and staid, very very whatever. Yes, and so I really like it. And there's one of the people in that group, who's a harpsichordist, has uh, his own disc out, things like that, and he's just really amazing. I don't recall his name right off the top of my head, but those people are doing all kinds of really important work, and I think they are helping people who were not open to classical music learn to have some appreciation for it.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with a lot of their like ensemble things. I've listened to a number of their harpsichord recordings because that's immensely helpful when you're learning a piece by Bach, because it helps to hear it on the instrument it was written for, because that will influence how you choose to interpret the piece. But yeah, I like to kind of broaden that out a little bit. I think it's interesting when you listen to music to think of it not as like this isolated thing, as like this singular piece was written at this singular point in time. And like this singular piece is what it is, because music, like every other art form or any other subject in the humanities, is like literature. It can be viewed through lenses and interpreted through lenses. And so you can study performance to be historical and do things historically through the historical lens of doing it how it would have been done in the time for historical accuracy. But you can also view music through the lens of time periods, and how people would play music during different time periods, or looking at cultural significance of certain pieces. So like you can take an ensemble like the Netherlands Bach Society, and they're really showing like they're like going back to the roots of like being a historical ensemble, and like
Right.
showing like this is what it would have been. And that's really interesting for history inclined people to see like, oh wow, they're playing with viols instead of violins, and these older string instruments that are similar but different from what we currently play with, and they're playing on period harpsichords, and that's really interesting. But that's just one perspective on the music, because you could also listen to another group that I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but you could probably find a group that's recorded, say, the Brandenburg concertos on modern instruments, not standard instrumentation.
Yeah.
You could probably find that somewhere, and it's not like it's defacing Bach because it's not what he intended for the music. It's just another way to view the music. If you approach that music with electronic instruments, you could still create something very, very artful and very powerful. And that's just a modern electronic view of something historical. Similar to how books age. I mean, we don't read a lot of books from the 1700s, but the ones that we probably do are like, we don't read them as if we are reading them in the time. We read them with the perspective we have now, and try to understand the perspective of the time,
Right.
and then we'll try to study the history of the perspective on those books throughout time.
Right.
So it's similar with music. And I think there's just a lot to be understood there beyond just history, and like this is exactly what it should be because this is what it was in the time.
To your point, there is on the Berlin Philharmonic website channel, they have a bunch of documentary films, and one of the set, or three that they did of the history of the orchestra, and they're interviewing musicians that were with the orchestra over a long period of time, like 30 years. And they said something interesting that the advent of recorded music changed the way these orchestras function. And they were much more different in the way they approached a piece of music before recordings. And afterwards, they all began to record these pieces almost alike everyone else. And there was this kind of sense that there was now a default way to approach a piece of music, where before there was that nobody really understood that, because nobody, people, nobody would see, a British or German, an Austrian, a Russian orchestra, probably in their lifetime. They'd see the orchestra that's in their town, and that's all they would ever see. And so they were saying how different the approaches to Beethoven's symphonies would be, and now it's, pretty much all the same. Have you heard that in
Yeah.
your education?
Yes, I've heard that a lot. I mean, you learn about that in music history when you're studying the 20th century, but you also learn about that when you're learning about conducting, when you're just in your piano lessons, is that um, there's lots of different ways to approach pieces. And with the advent of recording in the early 20th century, the environment of how people played music was very romantic. We're kind of exiting the romantic era and entering the modern age. Pianists and other musicians are playing very romantically, and they'll play older pieces very romantically. Um, like if you listen to recordings of Bach and Beethoven from the early 20th century, um, they're not going to sound at all historical. They're going to sound kind of like Liszt is playing Bach, which is an interesting phenomenon, because recording really brought about the advent of like historical study, because I think people realized that, hey, wait, this isn't necessarily how these pieces have always been done. And then some people tried to figure that out, but that doesn't necessarily mean that any one way is wrong. I think one of my favorite quotes that I've learned to laugh at is the famous conductor Toscanini once famously said that tradition in music is the memory of the last worst performance. Because all these someone was asking him about, like, oh, there's this thing in this Beethoven symphony that you didn't do that everyone does. Why didn't you do it? And he pretty much was saying, well, it wasn't in the score, so why should I? Which is one way to approach music. Someone like Beethoven would have marked it if he wanted it to be done. So some people say, well, you shouldn't disrespect Beethoven's intentions. But some people say, well, he's dead, I can do what I want.
That's a great conflict to have, isn't it?
Yep. And the further back in history you go with music, the more freedom you have within that dichotomy. Going back to Bach, who is kind of like the king of early music for the piano, this music wasn't written for the piano. A lot of it was written before Bach was aware of the piano, and Bach was actually, contrary to popular belief, he was aware of the piano's existence, but the version he was shown was the original version that was not very good, had lots of issues, and he was just like, no, this is a bad instrument. And so he still wasn't writing for the instrument. And so if you're playing Bach on the piano, you have a lot of freedom in choosing how much historical perspective you're going to incorporate and how much romantic freedom and individuality you're going to incorporate. And you can do a mix of the two. You don't have to choose one or the other. It's a spectrum. You can choose something in between a perfectly historical and a completely romantic take on Bach. And I'm sure if you went further back and played earlier Baroque, maybe even some Renaissance keyboard music, you would have immense freedom in deciding that, which is really interesting about studying music across different eras, is that composers get more and more and more
Yes, I can see that.
specific, or they have freedom in interpretation. So composers get more and more and more specific, to the point that, like, if you look at some pieces from the 1950s and 60s, there's like paragraphs written on every measure, on how you're supposed to do these things. And so it's a really interesting approach to the historical study of music.
Okay, my last question for you. This has been outstanding. I really appreciate you being here. And I'm gonna uh, take some clips out of your recital and add them to the show, because I think people need to see you playing.
Oh, excellent. Thank you.
Really excellent. Okay, here's my question. A lot of people, well, let's say some people who will be watching this or listening to this will have no connection to classical music at all. They've never heard it. They're, the most sophisticated thing they've ever heard is probably, a soundtrack of some, some soundtrack. So, which is in a sense the contemporary version of orchestral music. That it's the post-romantic. It's kind of a post-romantic music, if we want to classify it that way. So if someone is now intrigued about classical music, where would be a good place for them to start in terms of listening to music?
I mean, that I'm not sure how to answer that question without knowing a specific person. Um, Personally, I started getting into listening to a lot more classical music intently, like on my own time outside of just concerts. When I discovered a couple of pieces that sounded a little more video gamey. And so I would listen to those and I would try to find pieces that sounded like that because I wanted to play them and it sounded cool. But that's going to be different for everyone. I mean, I think Beethoven's great. But to someone who hasn't studied classical music and doesn't understand these large forms that make a piece be 40 minutes long, that might be a little bit much for them. But if you don't like listening to long pieces, maybe you listen to short pieces. Listen to some maybe 20 or 19th century character pieces by like Schumann, or some waltzes and mazurkas by Chopin, because those are all short 1 to 3 minute pieces that maybe could get someone interested. My biggest advice to someone who's interested in getting to know classical music is find someone that you know who does enjoy classical music and knows you, and ask them to give you a recommendation, because everyone has different tastes. Not everyone likes everything, but someone who knows you and your tastes and understands classical music would be able to give you a personal recommendation of what to listen to.
That's great. That's a very good. That's a great answer, and I think it's. And if you, and for those of you who are watching, and this puts you in this category, you want to ask, you can ask us, and I'll pass your question on to Alex, and or I'll answer it myself. So, thank you, Alex, for being here. It's been great, and feel like we just began to scratch the surface, but maybe we'll do this again. And
maybe.
And if you ever have stuff that you end up putting online, stuff, let me know, because we'll add it to the show notes, as a link in the show notes, so people can stay up with you and see where you're headed.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. And thank you, everybody, for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this. I have. And we'll see you next time here on the Eddie Network Podcast. Bye-bye.